We just talked in detail about microeconomics, where our focus was on consumers, producers, and markets. So we looked at the consumers and producers of pizzas, and we talked about the market for pizzas. Now it's time for us to look at the bigger picture. And we're going to talk about macroeconomics, where we look at the economy as a whole. So we're going to start the study of macroeconomics with a circular flow of income model that I have here. Now this is a pretty simple model where assume we got households and we got firms in the economy. It's a pretty simple, a closed economy. We're not looking at international trade. We're talking about resources within the economy. We're assuming there's no government, and to simplify it further, we're saying anyone who receives money spends it. We're not talking about savings to start with. Now, what we say is these households that we have in the economy, they own all the factors of production which they offer in the resource market. The firms, they go to the resource market and they grab all the factors of production because they need all these resources to produce goods and services. And when the goods and services are ready, the firms offer them in the product market. The households, they go shopping in the product market, pick up the goods and services. So households offer the factors of production in the resource market which are used by firms to produce goods and services, offered by them in the product market, shopped by the households. So what are the factors of production that we're looking at? So let's start with land. So all the real estate, that's owned by the households. Labor, so you got people living in these households who have labor. So we're talking about manual labor, we're talking about intellectual labor. So all those guys staying in here. Households, they own all the capital. And few of the households are entrepreneurs. The firms, they need all these resources for the production because these are the factors, the resources for production. And naturally, when the firms are using all these factors, they need to make payments to the households. So the firms, when they use land, they make payments for rent. When they use labor, the firms, they pay out wages. We're talking about salaries which are paid by the firms to the households. When they use capital, the firms, they pay out interest. And for entrepreneurs, you got profits. So all these rent, wages, interest, profits, these are paid out by the firms to the households. So for the households, all this is all income. The firms, they're going to use all these factors of production, produce goods and services which are offered by them in the product market. So they're giving out goods and services which are purchased by these households, and the households, they're going to pay to the firms now. Here they were receiving money from the firms. So this black line that you have here, this is the households receiving income from the firms. And now because they're consuming goods and services, they're going to pay out dollars back to the firms. Understand the flow. The households, they offered these factors of production, got back dollars. That was all the income. They used the dollars for spending, expenditures. So when we're talking about all that happened in an economy during a period, we're talking about all the production that happened in the economy, all the income that was earned by everybody in the economy, we could look at two different approaches. We could look at the income approach. We were talking about what's the income for all the households in the economy. Or we could look at the expenditure approach. What's the total amount of expenditure for goods and services during a period? So when we're calculating national income, so national income, we'll talk about GDP versus GNP. GDP is gross domestic product, which is the price of all goods and services produced within a domestic economy during a period. Then in a moment, we're going to talk about GNP, gross national product, which is price of all goods and services produced by the nationals of the country, whether they are within the country or abroad. So we'll talk about that, but first let's get the concepts right. So when we're talking about the income approach to calculate national income, so we're saying all the income by the households is rent for land, wages for labor, interest for capital, and profits for entrepreneurship. All that together is the national income. So comes to, if you're looking at all the nationals of a country, it is GNP, then that converts to GDP. So we'll talk about that in a moment. So let me put it as GDP for now. Then let's talk about the expenditure. So this is one approach of calculating national income. The next approach that we use is the expenditure approach. So the spending by all these households that you have here, we can call that consumption. So households, they got consumption. Now we also have spending by firms. So the firms themselves, they also make certain investments. So even that's spending for goods and services, where we're looking at capital assets. So you got firms which go for investment, and we're generally looking at capital goods here. Even households for that matter, they could go in for investment. Let's say they buy a new house. So that's an investment, a capital good. So we're looking at capital goods here. Now we started with an assumption of no government. Now let's get the government in. So when the government comes in the picture, the government, even they do a lot of spending. So the government spends money for education, for healthcare, for military. So all the government spending, that's again spending for goods and services in the economy. That increases the expenditure. Then let us say we bring in foreigners. So the goods and services which have been produced in the economy, you got foreigners also wanting those goods and services. So that would be exports. But then again, you would also have people in the economy who go out and buy goods from those foreigners. So when foreigners buy goods from the economy, that's export for the economy. When people in the economy, the households in the economy, they go abroad and buy goods, that's imports. So you got to net the exports of those imports. So you're going exports minus imports. So what we're saying is we're looking at all the expenditure for goods and services. We're talking about consumption by households. We're talking about investments. We're talking about government spending. We're talking about net exports. And all this put together is the gross domestic product, the price of all goods and services produced by the domestic economy during a period. So we're looking at consumption here, let's call it C. Investment, let's call it I. We're talking about governmental spending, so let's call it G. We're talking about exports, so let's call it X. Imports, let's call it M. GDP, let's call it Y. So you could say Y equals C plus I plus G plus X minus M. So this is the formula for you to calculate national income or gross domestic product. Now I've been differentiating between gross domestic product and gross national product, and let's go there, where I'll teach you a little bit of geography and I'll teach you all about national income. So here I have the map of the entire world here. Now I've drawn North America all that I could. I have South America here, I've got Europe, Africa, Asia, Australia. So that's your world map, simplified form. Now we're looking at the gross domestic product, let's say of the United States. And let's say you got Alaska here and you got a lot of United States here. So when I'm talking about gross domestic product of the United States, we are looking at all the production that's happening in the US during a period. So that's GDP. Now let's talk about gross national product. So that's the prices of all goods and services produced by the nationals of the country. So let's say we got US nationals here, lot of US nationals in the US, but you also have some foreigners. So I'm using the red pen for foreigners. We've looked at US nationals in the US, but you also have some US nationals in Canada. You got some of them in Mexico. You got a lot of them in South America. You got them in Europe, in Africa, in Asia, in Australia. So once again, when I'm talking about gross domestic product, I'm talking about all the goods and services produced within the economic boundaries, geographical boundaries of the United States. When I'm talking about gross national product, I'm talking about all the goods and services produced by all nationals of United States, whether in the US or abroad. So to move from GDP to GNP, I got to subtract all the job done by foreigners in the US and add all that is done by nationals out of the United States. So that's GDP versus GNP. We started a journey into the world of macroeconomics by looking at GDP. So I showed you the income as well as the expenditure approach to calculate your gross domestic product. And then we did GDP versus GNP. So that's gross domestic product versus gross national product. Gross domestic product we saw, that was all that was produced within the economy during the period. Gross national product, that was all that was produced by the nationals of the country, whether living within the country or abroad. Now let's talk about real GDP. So we've been talking about GDP. So what's real GDP? So let's go on the other side of my board. So when I'm talking about GDP, we're talking about prices, or the prices multiplied by quantity for all the goods and services produced in the economy. So that's price into quantity. So this is pretty simple, just for one product, and you've got zillions of products in a real economy. So you sum all that price into quantity and you get the gross domestic product. So GDP, and let's say I'm talking about the base year here. The first year is price into quantity. Now when we look at GDP in the next year, let's say the quantities have increased. It's become Q1 now. But even the prices have increased. So we'll talk about inflation in the next section, which results in increase in the price levels. So in the next year, prices have increased, quantities have increased. So this one is your new GDP. So GDP in the second year, let's say in year 2, that's P1 into Q1. So you're looking at new prices into new quantities. So GDP has increased. Some of the increase is due to increase in prices. Some of it is due to increase in quantities. But when we're talking about real GDP, we are only looking at what's been the actual increase in the quantity of production. So when you're looking at nominal GDP, we are considering both changes in quantities and prices. But when we talk about real GDP, we'll be looking at only the changes in quantity, not prices. So the way we'll do it is, instead of looking at the current prices, we look at prices as of the base year and we'll multiply that by the current quantity. So we'll look at quantities as the current year, but prices base year, constant prices. So if I look at this formula here, what we'll have is, we'll take prices from here, but the quantity from the current year. We'll do that for all the products and we're using constant prices. We have a base year from which we use constant prices for calculating real GDP. Now, the way we can convert nominal GDP to real GDP is by using a GDP deflator. So as you can understand, nominal GDP, that's going to be higher. So if you look at this chart, and if I use the blue pen, this is the normal GDP. But the real GDP, that's lesser than nominal GDP. So we use a GDP deflator to deflate nominal GDP to real GDP. Now, GDP deflator, that's basically a measure of the increase in price levels or inflation. So when we talk about inflation in the next section, we'll look into CPI, that's Consumers Price Index, or PPI, Producers Price Index, which are based on a fixed basket of goods. Now, GDP deflator, that's not a fixed basket. It's allowed to change from year to year with the consumption and investment patterns of the economy. So if I look at the formula for calculating GDP deflator, so you got real GDP is calculated as nominal GDP divided by the GDP deflator. Or in other words, the GDP deflator that we're talking about here, which deflates nominal GDP to real GDP, is nominal GDP divided by real GDP. Now we'll talk about an interesting phenomena. We'll talk about the multiplier effect of increase in spending on GDP. So we'll talk about multiplier effect. So what would happen if there is an increase in spending in the economy? We could look at increase in spending by households, firms, or governments. So an increase in spending would mean there would be more goods and services to be produced by the firms, which means they would be using more of the factors of production. So there's more dollars flowing in this way, and then it comes back as income to the factors of production which is owned by the households. So increase in spending would mean flow of income back to the households. Now more income to the households would mean more spending again. That means more income, payments to the factors of production. Again, more spending. Firms would use more factors of production to produce those extra goods and services, more income to the households. Again, more spending. So guys, as you can understand, there is a huge multiplied effect on the GDP. So the GDP would have increased infinite times if there is an increase in spending. But the issue with that, the consumers don't spend all that they earn. So there is a marginal propensity to consume, spend more. There is also a marginal propensity to save some money. So the formula that we have here is change in GDP is equal to the change or the increase in spending divided by marginal propensity to save. So what does not get spent? What gets saved by the households? So if you look at an example on your book, so it says if those making up the economy overall are likely to spend 75% of increased income and save the other 25%. So guys, their marginal propensity to consume is 0.75. Marginal propensity to save, that's 0.25. Then a change in spending of $100 or let's say $100 million would result in an increase in GDP by 100 divided by 0.25, that's $400 million. Let us say the marginal propensity to consume was 90% and saving was only 10%. So again, on the numerator you would have $100, spending increased by $100 million, marginal propensity to save was only 0.10, only 10%. How much would GDP increase by? That would increase by 1,000 million or $1 billion. So guys, as you can understand, a small increase in spending increases GDP multifold. So that's called the stimulus. So if you have a consumer driven economy where you have a huge marginal propensity to consume little bit of savings, you could have a multiplier effect on GDP by increasing spending. Now we're looking at inflation, which is the increase in price levels of goods and services in the economy. Now there could be two causes of inflation. The first one, it could be a demand pull inflation, where demand pulls the prices. The second one, it could be a cost push inflation, where increase in production costs, they push up the price levels. So let's first look at demand pull inflation. Look at what's happening here. So you have the aggregate demand curve, which has shifted to the right, a positive shift. There's been a lot of demand in the economy. What happens now is the price levels go up. The price levels are more. That's why we say it's inflation. And the good thing is, even the quantity has gone up. So there's more economic activity now. So aggregate demand, there's been a positive shift to the right. Now this increases price levels. Now that is why we're calling it inflation. Even the quantity has gone up. The equilibrium quantity has moved out. This would result in increase in GDP, yes, because earlier we had price into quantity. This was our GDP. Now the GDP has gone up. It's increased. And the good thing is, even real GDP has gone up because of the increase in quantity. Now let's talk about cost push inflation. Now let's say the production costs increased. So the supply curve, and we're looking at the short run aggregate supply curve, that has shifted to the left because it's more expensive for producers to produce now. Now because of this, naturally prices have gone up. So this was the equilibrium price earlier. Now prices have gone up, but quantity has gone down. So the short run aggregate supply had a negative shift. Prices have gone up, and that's why we're calling it inflation. But the quantity has gone down. We're not sure what's happened to GDP, whether it's gone up or it's gone down. But we know for sure that real GDP, that's gone down because quantity has fallen. So real GDP has gone down. So that is demand pull inflation. There's more demand in the economy versus cost push inflation, production costs increase. Now we are happy with a low and a steady rate of inflation. That's healthy for the economy. But the moment the rate of inflation is too high, that makes everything so very expensive. Everything becomes unaffordable. It hits consumption. It even hits the value of a country's currency and could lead to disastrous consequences. Generally, as GDP goes up, there are more jobs in the economy. There's more work to do. That increases the amount of employment in the economy, reduces the unemployment rate. But that might not be the case if the increase in GDP that's driven by technology. Or let's say business environment, business sentiment is pessimistic, such that businesses, they're getting their current employees putting more hours rather than getting new employees. But again, as a general rule, more GDP means less unemployment. So unemployment rate proves to be a very important indicator for economic recovery. It's a lagging indicator. And I'll discuss this when we're doing business cycles. So once again, unemployment rate is a rate, percentage of people who want to work, who are looking out for jobs but have no job. Now, reasons for unemployment. It could be frictional unemployment. So let's say there are some new people who've just entered the workforce, looking out for jobs, haven't yet found one. Or some people who have quit their jobs because they've had a friction with their boss. That's frictional unemployment. You could have structural unemployment, such that the job skills of the employees, prospective employees, do not match the needs of the employers. So let's say employers these days don't want to hire computer illiterates. So if you can't find a job because you don't know anything about computers, you have structural unemployment. Next, we could have seasonal unemployment. So let's talk about the retail sector or the hospitality sector. They've got a lot of business during festivals, holidays. So they may employ more staff on a temporary basis during these peak seasons. And that staff may be asked to stay at home during off season. So this is seasonal unemployment. But the most worrying kind of unemployment is cyclical unemployment. Now, this is caused by variations in the business cycles, and cyclical unemployment really shows out during economic recessions. When cyclical unemployment is zero, that's when we say the economy is at full employment. This is important. When I say full employment, I do not mean 100% employment. So even at full employment, we're going to have some levels of frictional, structural and seasonal unemployment. But at full employment, cyclical unemployment is zero. We'll now talk about interest rates, which depends upon the demand and the supply of money in the economy. Now, the demand of money is by firms or even individuals who want to borrow money to make investments, as long as the returns on investments is more than the cost of borrowing. Now, supply of money is by savings of individuals and firms. It's also determined by the monetary policy of the government. We'll talk about that. And this influences the level of aggregate demand in the economy. So let's put all these factors together. Look at them as one piece. So when interest rates are low, that means there's a lot of money supply in the economy. Now this causes the aggregate demand curve to shift to the right. There's more demand. But this also causes price inflation. Prices go up. To the contrary, when interest rates are high, there's less money supply in the economy. The aggregate demand curve, it's called a negative shift. It moves to the left, and that reduces inflation. So guys, as you can understand, all these factors are interrelated, they tie in all together. So let's say there's a lot of price inflation in the economy, and the central bank, they want to contain that price inflation. They want inflation to be low. So they might keep interest rates at a higher level. They might reduce the amount of money supply in the economy. But the problem is, this would also cause the aggregate demand curve to shift to the left. So let's get to the book and we'll look at interest rates, money supply and aggregate demand. Let's now look at business cycles, which are fluctuations in aggregate economic output over years. Now, business cycles can be depicted as a series of peaks and troughs. So after the economy reaches a peak, there is contraction. It could lead to a recession, get to a trough. And then there's hope, there's good news, there's recovery, expansion of the economy, get to the peak. And again, you have contraction, may lead to a recession, even a depression, get to the trough. And then hope, recovery, expansion, get to the peak. So that's all about business cycles. Now the question is, how do you know what part of the business cycle is the economy currently in? You might want to look at economic indicators. So you could look at leading indicators. These are indicators which change before the economy as a whole changes. So leading indicators could be very useful as short-term predictors of the economy. So let's say this pen here, that's a leading indicator, and my hand here is the way the economy is moving. So leading indicators move ahead of the economy. So if the leading indicator is going up, that means the economy might be going up in the short term. If the leading indicator is going down, that means it might lead the economy downwards. So that's how leading indicators work. They change before the economy changes. A good example of a leading indicator is, let's say, stock market prices. So if stock market prices are going up, that could predict that the economy would be doing good. But if the stock market is declining, that predicts that the economy might be going through rough weather. As leading indicators, you could also look at average hours worked per week, especially in the manufacturing sector. Or you could look at new orders received by manufacturing firms. New unemployment claims, even that could be a good leading indicator. Think about it. If the new unemployment claims have reduced, that means the economy is doing good. It's recovery, it's expansion. But if there is an increased number of new unemployment claims, that could mean that the economy might be going through a rough patch in the near future. Other leading indicators that you could talk about include building permits for new private housing units or index of consumer expectations. Now, apart from leading indicators, we might also look at coincident indicators. Now, these are indicators which change at approximately the same time as the entire economy. So, let us say this one is a coincident indicator and you got my hand again as the economy. So, it moves along with the economy. So, coincident indicators, they talk about present situations. For example, you could look at industrial production or you could look at manufacturing and trade sales. Now, apart from leading and coincident indicators, you also have lagging indicators. Now, these indicators change after the economy as a whole changes. So, let's say again, my hand is the economy and this one is a lag indicator. It goes behind, it goes after the economy. It changes after the economy as a whole changes. So, as lagging indicators, you could look at unemployment rate. So, I said new unemployment claims, that could be a leading indicator. But when you're looking at unemployment rate, that's a lagging indicator. Or you could look at the average duration of unemployment. Now, other lagging indicators could include average prime rate for bank loans, the interest rates that banks are offering to their customers. Or you could look at bank loans outstanding. Now, let's talk about the government's involvement in the economy. So, we'll start with fiscal policy. So, this is the use of the government budget to influence economic activity. So, government budget means we're talking about government revenue collection, taxes collected by the government, as well as government expenditure or spending by the government. So, let's say in times of a recession, the government might want to go for a fiscal expansion. They might want to stimulate the economy, increase the amount of economic activity. So, they could reduce taxes. So, a reduction of taxes by the government means there's more disposable income with the consumers and they would spend more, stimulate the economy, increase economic activity. Or the government could also go for increased spending. So, increased spending means more dollars from the government to the economy, more economic activity happening. The government could also go for a fiscal contraction. Now, it's usually undertaken to pay off government debt. So, the government has a lot of borrowings, they want to pay it off, go for fiscal contraction. So, they could increase taxes, take more taxes from people or reduce government spending. The government also has monetary policies in place. Now, this is generally enforced by the monetary authority. So, in the US, it's the Federal Reserve. In India, it's the Reserve Bank of India. So, the Federal Reserve in the US controls the money supply in the economy via its monetary policies. So, monetary policies include required reserve ratio. So, the banks in the economy, they receive deposits and they use the money they receive from deposits to loan it out. Now, required reserve ratio is the percentage of deposits that the banks must hold as a reserve. They can't loan it out. So, if the Fed is going for an expansionary policy, increasing money supply in the economy, they might want to reduce this required reserve ratio so that the banks can loan out more. But if they are going for a contractionary policy such that they want to reduce the amount of money supply in the economy, they could increase the RRR, required reserve ratio. Then as part of monetary policy, they've got another tool called open market operations. So the Fed could go out in the market and buy and sell government securities. So if the Fed wants to go for an expansionary policy, they want to increase the money supply in the economy, they could go out with lots of dollars in the open market and buy government securities. So when they buy government securities, they are injecting liquidity into the market, more money into the market. Let us say they want to go for a contractionary policy. Then they could sell government securities in the market. So when they sell government securities in the market, they absorb a lot of cash from the market that reduces money supply. So selling government securities is a contractionary monetary policy which the Fed could undertake. Another very important tool that the Fed has is the discount rate. So this is the rate at which the Federal Reserve lends out money to the banks. So if the Fed wants to go for an expansionary policy, they could reduce the discount rate. Reduction of the discount rate means lower interest rates, means increased money supply. But if the Fed wants to go for a contractionary policy, then they could increase this discount rate. Now, increased discount rate means increased interest rates in the market, reduced money supply. So guys, the Federal Reserve, they would go for the policy which would promote economic growth, ensure relatively stable prices. They're looking for low levels of inflation, and also make sure that employment is kept at lower levels. So guys, this was about government involvement in the economy, where we looked at fiscal policy and monetary policy. Now we'll talk about international trade, that's trade of goods and services between countries. So as we go through the book, we're going to talk about absolute advantage versus comparative advantage in the context of international trade. We'll also talk about trade restrictions and its effects on domestic and foreign producers and users. We'll talk about balance of payments, which is the account summary of international trade. And then we'll also look at foreign exchange rates. Our very last topic under macroeconomics is economic globalization. It refers to the increasing economic interdependence of national economies across the world through a rapid increase in cross-border movement of goods, services, technology and capital. Now, economic globalization has led to a single world market in which developed economies have integrated with less developed countries by means of foreign direct investment, by reduction of trade barriers and by modernization of developing countries.